Hello, my name is Ari Redboard. I am head of legal and government affairs at TRM Labs, the leading provider of cryptocurrency fraud detection and anti-money laundering software. Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is a monthly discussion with policymakers and business leaders in the cryptocurrency space. On January 6th, 2021, the storming of the United States Capitol by a mix of rioters, hooligans, and militants bent on upending the democratic process shined a spotlight on the already growing threat of domestic extremism. Domestic extremism, motivated by an array of grievances, ideologies, and white supremacy, is what the U.S. Department of Homeland Security called in 2020 the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. Who is the radical right? How do they use social media? How are they financed? And why is Bitcoin, according to white supremacist Richard Spencer, the currency of the alt-right? Today, I am joined by Mary McCord, the former acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security, and now the Executive Director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, ICAP, and Professor Megan Squire of Elon University, a Senior Fellow for Data Analytics at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and one of the foremost experts on tracking domestic extremists across social media. Thank you so much to both of you for joining me today. I'm so appreciative. You both bring such an interesting and unique perspective, and quite frankly, have been thinking about these issues really so much longer than most of us had. So really just so grateful to have you both on as real experts and leaders in the field today. Thank you.
Great to be here.
My pleasure.
Before we dig in, I would love to hear a little bit about your backgrounds and sort of what led you to this focus and real interest in this real threat of domestic extremism. Mary, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I come from a long history of criminal law enforcement for the federal government. In fact, Ari, you and I go back to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia, where I was a prosecutor for almost 20 years. And at the last few years of that, I was the head of the criminal division, which meant all of our national security cases were under my purview. And that's when I first started getting involved on a day-to-day basis with our nation's counterterrorism regime. I mean, at that time, we had some significant attacks, including the attack on our mission in Benghazi, Libya. From there, I moved over to the National Security Division at the Department of Justice as first the Principal Deputy AAG and later the Assistant AAG. And I moved to Main Justice, as we call it in the Justice Department, in May of 2014, 1 month before ISIS declared a caliphate. So the pace then for the rest of 2014, 2015, 2016, there was so much focus on ISIS, the threat of Islamist extremist violence, not only abroad with our US people traveling to join ISIS, but also the threat here in the homeland, because of course ISIS, particularly as more and more of the coalition countries started to close in on them in Syria and Iraq, more of them started saying, stay home and just commit to terrorist attacks at home using whatever you can get your hands on. And of course, for the US, that oftentimes means it's easy to get your hands on guns, right? It's easy to use your vehicle. And so as we were getting into later 2016 and 2017, we were also seeing that the rise in lethality from domestic violent extremism was really increasing. Now, I will say historically, it's always been on par with international and oftentimes above in terms of death rate on to international extremism in the homeland, in the United States. It's been more lethal for some time. People just don't tend to focus on that. But I was focusing more and more on that toward the end of my career at the Department of Justice. And I left there in May 2017. And just a few months later, we had the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so the flashing red lights in my head when I saw the car ramming, when James Fields rammed his car into a crowd of counter protesters, James Field, who has been there with a white supremacist group, engaged in open street battles all day long with counter protesters. When I saw that, I thought, this is what I was watching ISIS adherents do all over the world. There were car rammings, and as you may recall, right, all over Western Europe, Southeast Asia. We even had some here. And I thought, this is domestic terrorism, yet no one's really calling it that. And we need to start getting these things on a moral plane and recognizing as, you know, U.S. persons, the threat from domestic violent extremism.
Yeah, that's really extraordinary. You know, I remember reading a piece from the Benghazi team actually with this incredible comparison to the Capitol attack. And I was just taken back by it, like literally sort of, it was breathtaking in terms of the similarities. And yeah, no, I think I had a similar moment for sure. Mary, I just want to say one thing, like you and I did work together, and you know, there are some people in my career that I think of as sort of, whenever I came to them, we always got to the right place, and this sort of always desire to always do the right thing. And you were just always one of those people. You know, as chief of the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office. And, you know, I'm particularly honored to have you on this based because of that relationship. So just thank you.
Thank you, Harry. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Megan, I would love to sort of hear your background. I mean, you track these groups online really like nobody else, and you've really been thinking about it for much longer than anyone else. Sort of as I sort of tried to do my own research to prep for this, I just realized really how long you've been in this space, sort of trying to apply data science to these types of extremist groups. Can you talk a little bit of sort of how did you get into this and really start on this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a computer scientist, so it's a little bit unusual to think of someone with my background, at least academic background, studying this type of stuff. But long story short, I live in a small town in rural North Carolina, teach at a university here, and we had a group that was really acting out following the 2015 Charleston murders. They were afraid about the Confederate flags and statues coming down and began acting out around town, showing up at mosques and you know, HB2 protests and brandishing weapons and that kind of thing. And it's really scaring the local folks here. So some friends and I started the process of seeing if we could get them listed as a hate group with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And during the process of that, I just got really fascinated with what is a hate group? How does all of this work? And started watching the groups online and trying to, you know, figure out how they spoke differently, how they acted differently online, and just really got interested in that. Ended up figuring out how I could use some of my data science skills that I had been using to study toxic online software communities, translated those skills over to studying these new types of also male-dominated toxic online spaces. So a lot of the data models and the things that I had already been using to study, you know, some much more mundane topics and groups came in handy studying these new types of groups. So from there, I built out a bunch of data models studying Facebook, which at the time, 2016, 17 timeframe, 18, was still one of the predominant places where these groups gathered and organized. And actually, Mary brought up the Unite the Right rally. So I watched as that event was planned on Facebook and really started my first major data collection project using that data as the core. So ended up building out from there, and was pretty worried actually about that event. So I ended up, my husband and I actually drove up, and we were there that day. I was on the street when James Alex Fields rammed the crowd with his car. I was standing there. So yeah, a little up close and personal there. That was probably one of the lowest points of my life, actually, to remember that. So not to be a downer, but when I came back from the event, I kind of threw myself into the work even more, just trying to, I realized, you know, I already knew how serious it was, but that really kind of brought that home. And so from then I started studying more platforms, asking bigger questions, and just really trying to dig in and understand how something like that could come to pass.
Wow, just extraordinary to have an event like that and then to sort of dig in that way. Wow. Mary, sort of building on what you talked about, I mean, again, like as I started to sort of prepare for this, I realized, I mean, you testified before Congress almost exactly to the day a year before the Capitol attack. And I know that we all look at the Capitol now as this watershed, but you've really been thinking about this for way longer. And I think at least maybe, I mean, in the sort of recent past, could you sort of talk about how the threat has evolved and maybe where you see it today?
Sure. As Megan indicated too, the threat's been there for a very long time, but I think a lot of factors combined over the last 4 years during the past administration to really increase the imminence of the threat and the breadth of it and the expansive geographic nature of the threat, right? So we obviously have had isolated domestic terror attacks, El Paso, Poway, the Charlotte church, massacre, really, and other attacks like that. But now what we've been seeing in the last couple of years has actually been, we still see those lone actors, right? Those were lone actor events, but we see these massive groupings of people who have found others that are like-minded ideologically. And we're talking here, generally speaking, far extreme right and often overlapping with conspiracy theorists. And I'm sure Megan can talk much more about that because we've seen, particularly in the online world, a real overlapping and melding of conspiracy theorists, far right conspiracy theorists with just violent extremists, white supremacists, and unlawful private militia groups, which I'd also like to talk about. So these what you're seeing now is sort of radicalization of groups of individuals who come together and are willing to go out as a group and engage in very, very intimidating and coercive activity directly with the public. So not necessarily that mass shooting terrorist attack, but this feeling of license, if you will, to engage in a very intimidating and coercive manner with the public. So let me give you some examples. This past year, the year of the pandemic, which happily we seem to be seeing some light at the end of the tunnel, has been just incredible for bringing together coalitions of extremists to engage in intimidating behavior. It started, of course, even before the pandemic, when the state of Virginia, for the first time, had a Democratic legislature in both houses of its state legislature, and many Second Amendment absolutists, including pretty far-right extreme groups, used that possibility of more gun safety legislation as a coalition force to come in such vast numbers to Richmond in January that the governor actually declared a state of emergency because of concerns about that much firepower at the Capitol. And 2 days, or was it 3 days before that event, it was Lobby Day, they called it, 3 members of an accelerationist far-right extremist group called the Base, which translates into Al-Qaeda in Arabic, were arrested, who were plotting to use that event, that Lobby Day, and the presence of all that firepower there with Second Amendment advocates who were all coming heavily armed, ostensibly to lobby. They were going to use that as an opportunity to take a machine gun they had built and pick off a few people from sniper positions to trigger a civil war in the hopes of accelerating toward a white ethno-state in the Pacific Northwest, right? So this came together, pro-Second Amendment rights, violent extremists. The pandemic comes and you've got governors scrambling to determine how they can keep their citizens safe. You had a variety of governors, not all Democrats, some also Republican, issuing stay-at-home orders, shutdown orders, which is something that the far right was used as, again, as this coalescing force. These are infringements on our civil rights, these stay-at-home orders, masking orders, infringements on our civil rights. And they were given credence and license by the former president, who was actively egging on and really criticizing governors who were trying to take these type of public health measures, which were recommended by experts. But you saw groups actually, while armed, entering into state capitals in Lansing, Michigan, in Boise, Idaho, and other places, going to governor's mansions, heavily armed, dressed in full, military garb, attempting to intimidate and coerce the government to change its policy. Now, we'll get to this later, but the definition of domestic terrorism under the US Code is acts of violence. Now, they, for the most part, weren't actually committing acts of violence, but they were otherwise, brandishing weapons with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or to affect the policy through intimidation or coercion. And they were doing this. And of course, we saw drawing from that, and I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but I think there's a through line here. Drawing from that, just a few months later, the FBI thwarted the plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer and to either hold her on trial for, what they considered her crimes of having engaged in these public health measures, or even to assassinate her. That plot was thwarted. That was a group of extremists and unlawful private militia members who actually, were planning and had cased out where they were going to do it. And that thwart was spotted. So again, all coalescing around this, anti-public health measures. Come to summer, we have the killing of George Floyd. We have racial justice demonstrations that break out across the country. And this again, in part because of the former president calling anyone who committed any type of, isolated act of destruction of property, calling them violent anarchists, calling Antifa a terrorist organization. You saw same thing. You saw extremist groups, including private militia groups, self-deploying out into communities, ostensibly to protect property against these rumors of violent anarchists, and supposedly to augment police. But the reality is their heavily armed presence, their strong ideological views just escalated a tense situation. And we've seen the lethal results with the fatal shootings in Kenosha, Wisconsin, 2 people killed, another shot and injured, a shooting in Albuquerque, New Mexico, shootings in Portland, right? But again, egged on by the president who, has this veneer of credibility as the president, speaking from a position of power and privilege. We come into the election, and the president and his surrogates, even before the election, setting the stage for an argument that the election will be the result of fraud if he doesn't win, and the result of a rigged election as he doesn't win. And then, of course, he doubled down on that after the election, again, providing yet another coalition force. And this is what ultimately led us to January 6th, I think, for all of these extremist groups to come together. Again, conspiracy theorists who were seeding the disinformation that the president was propagating about a stolen election, that he had won in a landslide, even though there was no evidence to support that at all. But that gave a cause for extremists to come together. So your question was about how do I see the threat having involved? What's so worrisome to me is, on January 6th, you really saw an almost in the moment mass radicalization, right? You had people who were there who had gone clearly planning to commit a violent attack against the Capitol. And then you had thousands of others who, some of them may have actually honestly believed that the election was the result of fraud and they were there to exercise their First Amendment rights. But within that moment, the president that morning saying they could never concede, never give up, must fight like hell. Then you've got, again, your conspiracy theorists, your private militias leading the way, violently overthrowing police and entering the Capitol, and the crowd becomes a mob and the mob becomes violent, and you had what we had on January 6th. That's a threat to democracy. Those aren't isolated incidents, which are bad in themselves, but that becomes an underlying threat to democracy, not to mention public safety and national security.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a very helpful timeline. And I think a really good jumping off point for Megan here. Like, I think what Mary described, it seems to me, is like sort of something that may have started with isolated incidents, lone wolf sort of situation, and through organization and coalescing started to be more of a movement of some kind. It seems to me that a lot of that coalescing happened online, and a lot of places online. And Megan, that's really how you've spent your time. Can you sort of talk a little bit about the presence online and how these extremist groups use social media?
Yeah, big question. They definitely are online, and they're definitely using social media. That's nothing new. So some of early groups, decades ago, were some of the first people to see the potential in being online. Early internet, even before that, bulletin board systems and dial-in and all that stuff. So it's a method of spreading propaganda, growing their ranks, recruiting. And nowadays, increasingly, it's a means for them to harass people. So they actually use it as a hate vehicle that sometimes turns into entertainment and also recruitment. More recently, what I've been looking at is the use of online platforms for monetizing that propaganda, for fundraising, making money. So there's a wide variety of reasons why they're online and ways that they use different online services. I think in the run up to something like January 6th, there was a variety there as well. There's a bunch of platforms in use. There was mainstream platforms like Facebook and Twitter and things like that, YouTube. And then there were also these sort of niche alt style platforms that were being touted as maybe a little bit more free speech type of platforms, a little more forgiving in terms of what kind of harassment and hate was allowed on those. And so, yeah, what we saw was a lot of groups and individuals spreading propaganda that they themselves had heard from the president and others about the stolen election, mix that in with the grievances about the COVID and all of that, mixed with a generalized grievance series about white supremacy and so on. The protests over the summer, basically all the things that Mary said, just sort of this toxic cocktail of grievance and hatred. And then you layer on top of that misconceptions about what is, it's our capital, it's our building, we're going to take over, and you end up with this sort of shared fantasy of what should happen on January 6th. And unfortunately, a lot of that did end up coming to pass, which is not good. Mostly what I was focusing on as far as data collection and trying to find patterns in all of that was understanding the flow of propaganda across the different media platforms, social media platforms, understanding the impact of when you remove a bad actor from one platform and they move, how does that work? What happens at what rate? What's the effect of a disruption of a network?
So
I'm
sorry, so sorry to interrupt you, but would you dig into that a little bit? Because that to me is really interesting. I mean, so like what I'm assuming we're seeing here, you're on mainstream platforms, and then ultimately either they're removed from those platforms or feel like there's too much visibility on those platforms and move elsewhere. I mean, is that right? And can you sort of really a little bit to the analytics behind that?
Yeah, so it's hard to study because we don't have the data from inside the platform. So that's one of the I guess one of the frustrations of doing the work that I do is that you're always sort of desperate for data, and you know that it's locked up inside these golden cathedrals of the companies, right? So they have the data that would help us answer these really tough socio-technical questions. As an outsider, I can grab the data that I can find. So that's what I try to do, is be really creative about finding and analyzing the data that is available to me. With something like platform moves, propaganda flows across platforms, it's really tough. To add to the problem of not having the data, you also have that these are clandestine communities. They don't always want to be studied. So you've got everything, aliases and shady behavior and just all of that to add on. So it's quite a challenge. In terms of your question about what actually happens when someone's removed from a platform and they move to another one. So there's two big forks, or I guess one big fork in the road, two paths. It depends on whether the person's a high profile or low profile user. So when someone like the president, for example, is deplatformed, Trump was removed from Twitter and Facebook and so on, he actually didn't do much, nothing really happened. He didn't come right back. A lower profile user probably would. They would probably come right back to the platform, sometimes numerous times. There was one guy in one of my data sets that came back to Facebook at least 13 times, and those are the only ones that I found. So they'll usually just come right back to the platform to continue whatever bad behavior they were doing. And in terms of groups, though, when an entire group is removed from a platform, or more increasingly these days, an entire network, almost like an ideology, is removed. So I'm thinking about last summer when Boogaloo was removed, or when QAnon was disrupted on Facebook and Twitter and stuff. So when something like that happens, typically they're going to move to a completely different platform. So they're not going to come back to the same one they were on, or they might briefly. Usually it's not very successful. They're very disorganized, but sometimes they'll move to an entirely different platform. So you have this weird moment where there's like a business opportunity almost for that second platform. They have to decide what kind of world they want to live in. The one where they enable whoever's left over to continue that bad behavior. Do they want to be involved in that? Or do they want to also crack down? And sadly, unfortunately, a lot of times they'll choose that they want to enable the behavior. So we'll end up in a situation with like a Parler, for example, or something like that. So yeah, we find that their numbers are usually slashed when they move to the second, or third, fourth platform in a row. The numbers do go down. It's an open question, though, about the folks that remain. Are they the kind of harder edge types that actually, end up staying in the platform? Are they and then which direction is that causality? Like, were they already the kind of tougher, more hard-edged people that end up staying, or does the move to the new platform make them that way? So all of those are open questions that need a lot more study. There's been a few studies, but we need a lot more. So
no, that's really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to get back to you in a second because I have a lot more questions along these lines. But Mary, I think one thing that would be helpful is you mentioned initially, you sort of, as you started to define domestic terrorism, quite honestly, again, as I've sort of tried to dig into this myself, I mean, you have been really talking about the need for domestic terrorism statute for a really long time. I mean, I pulled an article here from 2018 where you're talking about the need for this, which is pretty amazing the way things have played out over the last few months. Can you sort of talk about why we need this and what you kind of envision this looking like ultimately?
Sure, it was a gap really that I identified. Now I will say at the outset, and I'll come back to this as I discuss it, that this is very, very controversial among civil rights and civil liberties groups. And by the way, I consider my current organization at Georgetown Law, ICAP, as a civil rights and civil liberties groups. We do constitutional impact litigation across the country, reforming criminal justice, immigration, First Amendment, etc. But it's controversial because of the relationship of distrust between primarily communities of color, vulnerable communities, and police. So from their perspective, any additional tool is a tool that could be abused. So starting from that premise, the gap that when I first started writing about this was a couple of days after Charlottesville's Unite the Right, when I saw an act of domestic terrorism. And I will say, as much as I disagree with many, many policy things that Attorney General Jeff Sessions did, that's one of the reasons I left the Department of Justice when I did, he actually did have the chutzpah to say James Fields was a domestic terrorist. And I think that was a good move. And it was one of the early moves that got more people at DOJ to call things what they were. But I knew there was no crime that he would be, no terrorism crime that he would be charged with, because none existed that applied to use of your car or frankly, use of a firearm to commit an act of domestic terrorism in the US. So let's get some definitions. So domestic terrorism and international terrorism are defined almost identically in the US Code with one difference. So they're both defined as crimes of violence that are in violation of any federal or state law when done with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion. There's a third thing that applies to like assassinations, but basically we're talking about violence to intimidate and coerce. The only difference between international and domestic is international terrorism means it has an international link. So think doing something on behalf of a foreign terrorist organization like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It could still happen domestically in the US. So think the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando or the San Bernardino shooting in California, which were done after the shooters pledged bayat to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. And so that was considered an international terrorism crime, even though it included right here in the US. So very confusing, I think, for people. The only difference in the definition about domestic terrorism is domestic terrorism just means it has no international component. It's just happening here in the US. These are very unhelpful definitions because terrorism ideologies don't stop at the borders. White supremacist terrorism here in the US, we tend to think of as a domestic terrorism issue because it's not connected to a foreign terrorist organization, but there's white supremacist groups, of course, plenty of them abroad. In fact, that's one of the pressure points. Shouldn't we be designating more foreign white supremacist terrorist groups as terrorist groups? And so far there are zero designations of foreign terrorist groups, white supremacist groups, but I digress. So under the law, there are some 51 crimes of terrorism that are defined as federal crimes of terrorism, and that impacts what other types of things you can charge when you're trying to prevent crimes of terrorism. It allows you to charge things like material support to terrorists, not material support to a foreign terrorist organization. That's a charge that's used very much in international terrorism. The charge, in fact, that's used the most post 9/11. But I'm just talking about material support to terrorists. But of those 50-something terrorist crimes, not one of them applies to a mass shooting or a car ramming if it is not connected to a foreign terrorist organization or not targeted at a US government official, right? So there is a gap. So of the 50, you might say, well, what are they? Well, they're things like using a biological device, a nuclear device, a radiological device, a weapon of mass destruction, hijacking or shooting down airplanes, attacking mass transit. So they're very specific to those types of things. So the reason we have a little bit of it, so we have a lack of moral equivalency. Let's start with that, because until recently, I think people think terrorism, they think Islamist extremists, they think Muslims, and that's where brain went post 9/11 until recently. And I started writing about this in 2017, when really we had hardly ever used the word domestic terrorist against white supremacist terrorists. I mean, even Charleston wasn't, and I think I said Charlotte earlier in this podcast, yeah. Charleston wasn't even really considered by the government, was never formally called domestic terrorism, and clearly it was. So there'd been a real reluctance, and I noted that moral lack of equivalence, that we needed to call this what it is. There's also a lack of data, partly because we don't have an offense that applies to the most common type of terrorism in the US, so that we don't have perfect data on it. We have perfect data on every investigation, prosecution of an international terrorism offense, because it all has to come through the National Security Division, so they keep complete tabs. And we don't have good and any real significant effective measures to counter it. Partly when you lack data, you don't have those measures, resources, you need to drive resources toward it. But there was another more significant gap, which I think is illustrated really well by the example of the base that I gave earlier. So terrorism, the US counterterrorism program has really been focused, particularly since 9/11, but even before that, on preventing acts of terrorism, right? We don't want to be prosecuting the San Bernardino shooter after the fact. They were killed, so there was no prosecution. We'd rather have prevented that shooting. The people will say, well, why not use hate crimes? Well, first of all, not every hate crime is terrorism. Some are, some aren't. But the hate crimes has typically, historically, doesn't always have to be this way, but has historically been viewed as a way to bring justice to victims of crimes after the fact, right? By calling it a hate crime and prosecuting a hate crime. So how do you create a prevention strategy for domestic terrorism? And one way that our terrorism statutes do that in the international arena is through the material support to terrorists. So when a person so these members of the base, right? They were building a machine gun. They were planning to start a civil war that would allow them to emerge with the creation of a white ethno-state. So clearly ideologically motivated, crimes of violence were being planned to intimidate our course. No question, I think that it's terrorism. But because they were planning to do this with a firearm, when they were caught, there was no terrorism crime to charge them with. So they were charged with building a machine gun, unlawfully building a machine gun, some other weapons related offenses that are not considered violent crimes under the code, harboring an illegal alien, because one of the three was from Canada and come in across the border illegally. And he was also charged with entering the country illegally, and a smattering of offenses that don't have anything to do with terrorism or frankly, even violent crime. Now, they were able to be, the plot was thwarted, so that's good. And they were able to be detained, although I will say in a related case of a Coast Guard lieutenant who similarly was plotting a series of mass shootings and amassing an arsenal of AR-15s, he was charged with 3 pretty minor crimes. And the magistrate judge, when he was first arrested, said, I'm not going to be able to detain him because he wasn't even, you haven't even charged him with a crime of violence. How can I detain somebody on a offense of unlawfully possessing a silencer and unlawfully possessing drugs and unlawfully possessing a firearm as a drug addict? Those are the 3 charges he was charged with. Now they appealed that to the district court judge. The district court held them. But my point is, these are cases that was thwarted, but they're not charged with anything even vaguely resembling terrorism. Sometimes that they may be able to have a sentence that is significant enough that many people would think that's enough. They don't need more. When they get out, nothing is going to say they were involved in a crime of terrorism. And some cases might not be getting thwarted, right? Because investigators tend to open up investigations planning to investigate a certain crime. And so it would drive resources toward those type of investigations to have that crime with the right level. Right now, investigators are using sort of square pegs and putting them in round holes. And just to last point I'll make, because I know we need to move on, is so what I was envisioning is a crime that would apply to all terrorism in the US. Islamist extremist terrorism, white supremacist terrorism, anarchist terrorism. If it's a crime of violence, enumerated crimes, so the most serious crimes, murder, kidnapping, assault with significant bodily injury, when done with the intent to intimidate or coerce, that's just terrorism in the territorial US. That then becomes a predicate for this material support to terrorists. And so when a person is building a machine gun or amassing an arsenal of weapons, planning to commit a series of mass shootings for terrorism purposes, then he's in violation of that crime because it prohibits providing material support or resources or disguising the nature of resources. So think machine guns, AR-15s, knowing and intending that they're going to be used in a crime of terrorism. That's a gap to fill. Last point I make, promise. I understand and I appreciate the concerns of those who are worried about giving another tool to law enforcement. I really do. And so things I've been thinking about a lot are, and have added in the things I've written, are transparency and robust oversight. So not just sending us a classified, memo to Congress once a year, but transparency of the FBI. How many investigations did you open in what categories? White racially motivated violence, far left violence, animal rights activism, right? And match that up with the threat. Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, has been clear that the threat is from white supremacist extremism. So this type of data would show, are you putting your resources, law enforcement, to the threat, or are you opening up bogus investigations into groups in people who are not the threat? So that's not a perfect solution, and I think it's something to discuss and talk about. And the other area, if we have time, is Congress could take action against unlawful private militias also in a way that I think would close another gap.
Yeah, that is all extremely helpful. I mean, look, I think the folks in our old office in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. are just doing extraordinary work. I mean, day and night on the Capitol. But I look every day how hamstrung they are by the sort of authorities that they have. And you see these charges, the charges we used to do for White House fence jumpers, or, you trespass on federal lands, or maybe, you get a gun charge here or there. But there needs to be foundational, changes to really sort of give them the tools they need. Megan, sort of jumping off all that, I mean, I think the sorts of attacks that Mary has described require funding of some kind. These aren't maybe sort of these huge, Al-Qaeda-esque 9/11 type style attacks, but they do require some funding. And I think you talked earlier about the way they're using social media, but obviously, the audience today is very interested in sort of the cryptocurrency space and how these individuals are using crypto. You mentioned sort of this intersection between social media and fundraising or finance that you're really digging into. I know DLive in particular is one of those sites, but now they've gone to other ones. Can you sort of talk about what you've seen in the sort of fundraising, particularly in the cryptocurrency space for domestic extremists?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mary talked about transparency. That's one of our big, I guess, wins when these groups move into cryptocurrency. Some of those currencies, of course, have an open and transparent ledger, which makes tracking them at least conceptually more doable than if they were using some other funding mechanisms. So I've done several projects trying to unravel white supremacist and other hate group style funding. And yeah, most recently worked on one with DLive. Before that, I worked on a project, really big project with Proud Boys and Venmo, which I think was covered yesterday in the New York Times piece. It was a really long piece. So I won't cover that one again, but the DLive stuff is a little more interesting. It's a little more creative, has some aspects to it that the audience might be interested in. And it does touch on the crypto side, which is growing.
Megan, if you could just really sort of start at the beginning of sort of your experience with DLive and really walk us through the way they use this platform for fundraising for the intersection with crypto.
Yeah, so DLive is one of a family of services, video game streaming site. It's designed for people who play video games. They put their camera on or their screen on film, and you can watch them play the game. And these are enormously popular. Just if you don't get why somebody would want to watch someone else play a video game, just set that aside and take it as assumed that this is a really big market. There's a lot of people that actually do want to do that. And so while you're playing the game, you can be chatting with the people watching you, and they can chat amongst themselves. And sometimes they'll often give donations, like tips, if you do a move they like, or you say something funny or what have you. So DLive is one of these websites that allows content creators, video game streamers, what have you, to make this kind of content, accept these kind of tips. More recently, game streaming sites like DLive and YouTube and Twitch and others have been sort of used by political streamers. So they're not playing video games, they're just going to talk. Sometimes actually they'll talk about political things over top of playing a video game, but increasingly they're just using them as a way of live streaming themselves talking. So maybe they're in front of a green screen, sitting at a desk, telling their, racist, homophobic, anti-Muslim, whatever take on the news of the day. They're also taking donations from users and viewers while this is all going on. So this is a new way of monetizing propaganda. They can be spewing hate and making money at the same time on these style of platforms.
And just to stop you right there, I mean, I saw that you tweeted on January 5th about this someone on DLive essentially threatening to potentially kill legislators.
Yes.
Literally, I mean, hours before. I mean, just really extraordinary stuff to be able to sort of follow this in that. Up through events. So no, please go on. That was extraordinary. Yeah.
It's certainly alarming. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I started studying it. So I started my project in June of 2020. The DLive had just moved to the third iteration of their so-called blockchain. It's really more of a public ledger, but anyway, they just moved to this third iteration of this thing, and the data was available on their site publicly. So a friend of mine showed me how to connect to their API and wrote some software to start pulling down these ledgers for different folks that I was interested in watching, including the guy you just mentioned who made that threat on January 4th, I think it was. But anyway, so I'm pulling down all the data, I'm throwing it in a database, and I'm starting to analyze, how much are they making? What's the ecosystem look like here? Who's donating to whom? What kind of numbers are we talking about? How big is this? How many viewers do these guys have, and how much money is actually changing hands? I also had to reverse engineer like how the site works, what are the transaction types, and just all of it, basically from my vantage point. So I'm not inside the company, but I'm like looking at the exhaust fumes, I guess, of how their company works. And ran a couple stories with Southern Poverty Law Center, just alerting people to the threat as we saw it developing around the election, especially. So I think in November we ran a story about just how much money was changing hands. And at that point in mid-November, some of these guys were clearing $10,000 a month. It was about high $300 a day, and they weren't streaming every single day. This is just for a couple of hours worth of work. So this is just purely donations, just for live streaming. After that article ran, though, I kept collecting data because I wanted to see what was changing in the ecosystem after the election. So I noticed a few big donations come in around the election, but as the Stop the Steal rhetoric ramped up, and as the in-person events in the different state capitals ramped up, you'd have InfoWars showing up here with the van, and you'd have Nick Fuentes showing up in the state capitol, and megaphones, giving speeches, that kind of thing. How I was curious how that changed the donation patterns. Did it change them at all? Did it increase, decrease, and just what was going on in that space? Sort of the intersection between this online donation reality and then the offline world. So just watching all of that and filming, and what I noticed was some of the highest earnings folks before the election continued that. One of them in particular, I think, cleared $44,000 just in November and December after the election, pitching Stop the Steal and other, election-related conspiracies. Also some vaccine stuff too, anti-vaccine. So this was alarming. So there was another channel that when President Trump tweeted out that DC was going to be wild, and that everybody should show up on January 6th, that channel cleared $2,000 that night, and they had never made more than $20 a night before that. So, I mean, there was clearly some activity going on as far as the money, the hyper focus on that day, And so, as the week of January 6th, as that week approached, it really started reaching a fever pitch. There was a lot of planning, a lot of attention on the event, a lot of fundraising around going, things like that. And of course, on the actual 6th, I was watching streamers on DLive from inside the Capitol. They were actually using that service and live streaming from inside and making, taking donations while they were doing it.
And the donations on DLive, how does that would you just sort of explain that process quickly? Sort of how do you donate, and is this in cryptocurrency, or is it in fiat? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's an in-game, it's like a site currency. It's called Lemons, and you can buy them with your Amazon Pay if you're on the browser. You can use cryptocurrency to buy them. If you're on a mobile device, you can do them as an in-app purchase, so from the App Store or whatever. It's a pretty transparent, pretty easy process. I just put together a paper that hopefully will be published, going more in depth about the different payment types and what we can learn from that data exhaust stream about how people are paying and when they choose to buy different sizes of bundles and all that kind of nerdy stuff. You can get really down into the weeds on that, but the bottom line is it's really straightforward actually to buy the site currency, both to cash in and cash out. The cashing out, of course, is when these guys get to take the donations and turn that into rent money or groceries or whatever, and that process is pretty transparent as well.
So let me quickly follow up with something, and
yeah.
I'm going to stay with you, Megan, and then Mary, you should feel free to jump in on this. So, from a cryptocurrency standpoint, obviously, I've seen a lot of interest in Bitcoin and sort of fundraising in crypto from these groups. I think you probably saw a lot of it after Charlottesville, when a lot of them got kicked off sort of traditional financial money service businesses like Visa, MasterCard, PayPal. You may have seen sort of a move online, but I'm not sure that's entirely right from the data. But is that consistent with what you've seen? And what does it mean to say that domestic extremisms have been using crypto or sort of moved into crypto?
Yeah, there's really two reasons why well, first of all, yes, cryptocurrencies are absolutely important to these groups. It is indispensable at this point and entrenched. So we'll just start with that.
Yeah, why is
that? So there's two reasons.
Okay.
The first reason is necessity. So what you talked about, a big event happens, Unite the Right, insurrection or whatever, they are removed either as a group or as an individual from payment systems that we all, normal ones that everybody would use. And they therefore get kind of pushed into using cryptocurrency in order to attempt anonymity, to remain clandestine, what have you. So I would say that's by necessity. There's a big other reason, though, that a lot of these groups, especially like the January 6th insurrectionist type groups, are like cryptocurrency, and that's that they believe in it. They actually like it. They think that it's more liberty minded and all of that kind of thing. So imagine like the libertarian patriot types. They just want to use crypto and they like it. So you have both of those strains. You have the ones who come about it sort of naturally, and then the ones who maybe it's a little more of a chore. A system like DLive is yet another way that they get involved, and that is that it looks like just a regular gamified, site currency. It doesn't look like anything sketchy or difficult to use or particularly ideologically based. It just looks like an in-game currency. So yeah, there's many ways to come at it, but at the end of the day, all of these groups now are using cryptocurrencies of different whatever flavor.
Interesting. Mary, did you want to jump in on the financing piece?
This is fascinating because I get asked about this a lot, and I don't know nearly as much about that as Megan. One of the things that's been amazing to me, though, is for some of because we do not designate domestic groups as terrorist organizations, they do have a lot more freedom to fundraise, and sometimes we rightly don't designate, I think, because of First Amendment concerns. But I've even also seen oftentimes they'll have GoFundMe accounts, or they'll use a derogative term, anti-Semitic term, and create accounts similar and those type of things. So open and notorious, like it's not even hidden in some of the fundraising that they are doing. And some of those types of platforms like GoFundMe were pretty slow, I think, to take them off their platforms, but maybe that's been changing, and particularly post January 6th, I think we'll be seeing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I see, I've seen Richard Spencer on Twitter with a Bitcoin address asking for donations to that specific address, obviously. And I think, Megan, you made the point, which is a good one, and that is you can use blockchain analytics like TRM and other companies to actually trace these transactions in a way that you can't in fiat. I mean, Mary, we dealt with sort of bulk cash smuggling and terrorist cases and all this sort of thing in narcotics. You can't do that in crypto. And that's sort of one of the beautiful things about it. But I also agree with your point that obviously sort of that power and promise of cryptocurrency, that permissionless, beautiful, democratic financial system is obviously susceptible to these sorts of actors. It's a lot easier to move money. There's no question, but it's a lot easier for law enforcement to trace it as well. Guys, we could literally talk about this probably all day, and I might just hold you guys for a while after we stop recording. But I do want to sort of finish with one thing in particular, and that is we tend to bust out the crystal ball and sort of ask for some predictions or sort of what's coming next. Mary, I'd love to start with you. I mean, there's a new administration. They're sort of thinking about these issues in a different way. I will say that, like, I have been just blown away by the law enforcement response to what happened at the Capitol, and just the resources and the thoughtfulness that's gone on with these prosecutions, obviously, particularly for, based on my feelings for the U.S. Attorney's Office and how they typically do the job. What's next? I mean, even without the sort of legislation that you laid out, what can this administration do, and what do you imagine we're going to do in this area?
I mean, just for starters, to acknowledge the problem is a vast, and quit actually adding to the problem, and instead acknowledge that this is a problem and we need to combat it, is, light years ahead of where we've been for the last 4 years, where there was a denial that there was even any, threat from the violent extremists. So, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that this can't just be a government thing, right? And Ari, you and I saw this when because people often thought, what is the government doing about international terrorism too? And the government's an important player, and law enforcement need to be able to protect public safety while respecting constitutional rights and civil rights and not abusing authorities, but they need to use the authorities they have. And that's not just the federal government, but states and locals. Private militias are unlawful in every state, yet they are rarely ever confronted by state and local law enforcement. So state and locals need to be part of this. Better information sharing, right? The apparatus for sharing information about international extremist groups is robust, and it's much weaker when it comes to ideologies like white supremacist ideology. And that can be done with no new surveillance authorities. We're just talking about sharing government to government and sharing within the government, not only federal, state, local, but into the public, into the private sector, into the community. But I think that even with, various resources pulled together, we need businesses, right? We need companies to take it seriously, to ferret out extremism with the potential to be violent extremism from their own employment force, as well as those whom they're willing to provide their services to. They need to take that seriously. And I'm not just talking about tech, right? I'm just talking about mainstream, American companies. We need, religious leaders, musicians, rock stars, athletes. Like, everyone needs to really recognize the threat and everyone has a different lever, right, that they can push to try to put pressure on this movement. And it is not mainstream and it is not accepted. And that needs to be made very clear. The last thing I would say is that, we are right now in a little bit of a honeymoon period, because just like after the Unite the Right, after January 6th, on that day, gosh, they feel proud and emboldened and look what they did. They accomplished this amazing thing. And then in the ensuing days, as like the universal condemnation rains down upon them and they get deplatformed and, everything, they start finger pointing, they start imploding. We saw it after Unite the Right. Some of those organizations don't even exist anymore. And they start, and, one large nationwide militia organization that had members there, they have now disbanded. They'll just reappear some places. So we're in this a little bit of a lull. So I think it's important right now to think strategically, because they're not gone at all. In fact, the harshest are very active, and they're just and they'll come together around other coalescing forces. And there's still, some of them are still on Stop the Steal. Others have migrated to the pandemic as a hoax. When in doubt, they'll go to, guns as their, coalescing force. So this is a time to actually get our act together and try, as a whole of society, not just whole of government, approach toward it, which also includes a whole nother topic for a whole nother day, which is dismantling structural racism in our institutions.
No, thank you so much. Megan, sort of same question, and maybe it goes to some of Mary's public-private partnerships. You talk a lot about DLAV. I know you've done a ton of work there, but because of people like you, quite frankly, they're going to figure out what's next. Right? I mean, you have now infiltrated this, you understand it, you know who's fundraising there, you know how much they're fundraising, you'll use tools, data analytics tools. What's next? I think particularly in the fundraising cryptocurrency space, but feel free to sort of dive into social media as well.
Yeah, it's a technology shift. It's a pendulum swing, but that is related to, I don't know which direction the causality is here, but related to a similar shift in the groups themselves. And that's the theme of decentralization. So Mary described a moment where they're, like she called it a honeymoon period or whatever. I usually describe it like the jar of marbles has hit the floor and they're sort of rolling around everywhere. They haven't yet found where they're going to land, but I'm pretty sure that the next phase will be one that's more decentralized than the current landscape, or the landscape we just got out of. And it will be decentralized both in terms of the groups themselves. So maybe we don't have as many groups. There's going to be a little bit more branding, more ideological focus, more I'm a fan of type of behaviors, rather than I just bought the membership card and the t-shirt and now I'm a card carrying member. That kind of thing will probably die out a little bit, at least temporarily. And then that same idea of decentralization will happen with technology. So the way they move off of mainstream platforms and more towards niche platforms, off of mainstream financial systems and towards something like cryptocurrencies, that all will continue to happen. Systems like DLive, even though they seem very exotic and weird, were actually fairly centralized. That's why they were able to remove guys like, the ones that were streaming on the 6th. That's why they were able to be removed from the platform. So there will be a trend towards creation of platforms and moving to platforms where that's not as possible. So, and yes, I'm already tracking them on those places and have anticipated that. So that would be the focus of the next year of my life, probably, is building out those systems. And I'm just watching that all take place, seeing if I'm right, seeing if I'm wrong. And yeah, it's just move to the next thing.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. Literally, I could spend a lot more time with both of you on these topics, and maybe we're just going to have you back for more discussion. So no, thank you so much. It's really an honor to have experts like you in this really incredibly complicated and but also sort of critical moment. And I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining me on TRM Talks today. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of cryptocurrency fraud detection and anti-money laundering software. Looking forward to another terrific discussion next month with movers and shakers from the world of cryptocurrency. Until then, thank you to all of you who work so hard every day to keep us safe.